Welcome to Parashat Yitro. Let us dedicate our learning today to the Refuah Shelema of Chana bat Sima Fega, of Harav Eliyahu Shimon ben Mazal Fortuna, and also for Tzipora bat Esther. They should all have full and tremendous healing. They should be restored to not only their former strength, but even greater strength. With that, let us start Parashat Yitro. We need a small introduction because I had entitled the class, The Process of Revelation. It might not be what you expect. I think the Jewish people, for them, it wasn't what they expected. So let's start to take it apart. But first, I want to revisit a couple of the elements from last week's Parashah that were actually a segue. They were whispering messages to the people back then as they are whispering to now, to us as well, for our generation. I just want to make sure that we didn't lose the message, that it wasn't lost on us. And what I mean by that is, I want to revisit two elements of last week's Parashah. Last week, Beshalach was a major story. The Jews left Egypt, the sea split. We spoke about the fake news and how events were interpreted by Paro. We spoke about how the natural world was turned on its head. And we spoke mostly, and I want to bring that into this week's Parashah, we spoke about Miriam, and we expressed how the Torah calls her a Nevi'ah. And prophecy, we had said, is open to all, past and present. Every one of us has the ability to be a prophet or prophetess. It is not an exclusive club. It is not something that once was. You've heard the term Ein Chazon b'Yisrael, maybe. So there were no more visions, let's say, in the time of Shoftim. But for us today, I do believe that this idea of being able to prophesize is still alive and well. I'll be more clear about this point as we move forward, but I want to reiterate that what we had said about Miriam, what made her a prophetess, the ability to see into the future, came from within her. She did not receive a divine calling. God didn't come to her in a burning bush and say, I'm going to split the sea, so take some musical instruments with you so that you could celebrate once that happens. She may have even been the one to enact the miracle by being prepared for it. This is a very important part of this week's Parashah as well, meaning we're ready. We're prepared. We know that Hashem has in the past and will in the future bring about Yeshuot that may be beyond our comprehension. We may not be able to write the script and see how it's going to unfold, but we are sure as heck that there will be a redemption. That's the knowledge that we want to walk in with. We want to bring Miriam and her reaction last week in with us. We also want to bring in the end of last week's Parashah. We spoke about it on Shabbat, but we didn't have time in our Zoom class. So I'd like to also reiterate that at the end of last week's Parashah, and it's not haphazard the way the events are unfolding. Right before Yitro is going to come on the scene, if you'll turn to the end of last week's Parashah, which is chapter 17, verse 8, we're going to have Amalek, Vayavo Amalek. Amalek is going to come onto the scene. And I'll say this before we even read this Parashah of Amalek, the verse that immediately precedes it has the Jewish people back then but it's not a question that was only asked in the desert. It's a question that is continually asked by future generations, and therefore it's recorded. It's a pitfall that the Torah wants us to be aware of, and it wants us to say, humanity has certain tendencies. And one of those tendencies, which is in verse 7, I shudder to even read these words, but they're here so that we could be educated and learn from this, is the end of verse 7 in chapter 17, when the name of the place is called Masa Umerivah, because of a quarrel that Bnei Israel had when they tested God. And you know what they asked? Hayesh Hashem bekirbenu im ayin. I'm embarrassed to even read those words, but they are a truth. They are a reality in the human psyche. It's called in English maybe doubt. The question that's being asked is twofold. One, is God in our midst? Is he in our communal, national midst? Is God still operating? Is he a God that created the world and left us? Is he still functioning? Is he still within our center? So it could be a national question, and the verse is going to come in the plural, nasotam, and they said bekirbenu. So it's so much easier for us to remove ourselves as individuals from this question. The question is asking, I'm going to paraphrase it, where is God? Is God within us? Is he in our midst, or isn't he? And the reason that they asked this question was for a simple thing. They didn't have water to drink. And it's not like they didn't get the water. They got the water that they needed to drink. So the question isn't asked at a time of need and necessity. Here is the real question. They're not just asking, is God within our national center? Hayesh Hashem bekirbenu, within us. I understand there is an extent that God is protective of his people as a nation, but Hayesh Hashem bekirbenu, as individuals, to what degree do we possess divinity? Do we possess a tselem? Do we possess this godliness inside of us? When you ask either of those questions, the next verse is going to be, you're opening the door for Amalek. And if you have the markers, those ever elusive highlighters that I keep bringing out, if you have them, now would be a good time to use them, because in the next few verses, from verse 18 through verse 16, from verse 8 through verse 16, you're going to be very well rewarded. Because if you start to underline every time it says Amalek, you're going to find that Amalek is going to appear exactly 7 times. He is part of the construct of the natural world. What does Amalek represent? Amalek, we're going to say, is the first thing that enters. He enters together with doubt. Where there is doubt, where there is a cloud of a fog, where we can't see clearly, Amalek is more than happy to enter that space of doubt, that space that was created with doubt. Now, if you have your highlighters, pick up another color and underline every time you see Moshe's name, because Moshe also appears in our story here, in these few verses, exactly 7 times as well. And so the world is created with a balance of doubt but it's also created with, we have the Moshe, the certainty, the part that is going to be redeeming for us, the voice that's going to cancel out the voice of Amalek. So we have those two, but I can't say for sure that one is canceling out the other. It seems like if I put them both on a scale, there's equal Amalek as there is to Moshe, both their names appearing exactly 7 times. And like I said, if you pull out your highlighters one more time, pick a third color, there's another word that's also going to appear exactly 7 times. And that word is the yad, is the hand. And you could start to say yad is 14, Moshe is 7, Amalek 7, 14. I want to say something totally different. And I want to say that what's going to be the deciding factor of us falling into the world of doubt that is Amalek, or the world that is revelation that's brought down from Moshe, where are we going to stand on this scale? How are we going to tip the scales in our favor? How are we going to remove the doubt that asks, is God or isn't God within our midst? And the answer is going to lie in our own yadayim. You got the whole world in your hands. It's in your hands. It's in our hands. It's in our ability. It's in our decision. It's in our thought process, whether we're going to fall on one side or on the other. And it's interesting because at one point it says, V'yedei Moshe kevedim. Moshe's hands were very heavy. And finally in verse 13 it says, Vayehi yadav emunah. Moshe's hands are synonymous with emunah. It means that our hands are synonymous with emunah. Well, I don't even know what that means. Our hands are synonymous with faith. What does that even mean? Well, we entered this endeavor. Amalek came in because we had a lack of faith. And now, in order to regain a sense of understanding, of belief, of faith, or of trust, we're going to have to use our hands. And I still haven't explained exactly what that means. And we end off a little bit on a cliffhanger. This is what's going to segue our Parashat this week. So although I didn't flesh out for you, what does it mean that we hold faith in our own hands? It sounds actually oxymoronic. Faith is something that should be external to us, elusive, out there. That's the whole definition of faith, is it's something that's not tangible, that I can't hold with my yadayim. And yet this verse, V'hi adav emunah, the emunah lies within our own hands, is something that's going to be now explained to us when we come to read Parashat Yitro. So these 2 ideas from last week, that Miriam is a prophetess because she's able to have faith that the best case scenario, that a happy ending will come. And the story of Amalek that tells us there is a balance, Moshe and Amalek, there is a perfect weight on both sides of those two. You know, the 1 degree, what's going to tip that scale? Because the scale of doubt, there is so much doubt that a human is endowed with. We need to combat that with a sense of Yadayim and Emunah, which we're going to talk about now as we get into Parashat Yitro. So again, it's beautiful. Why? Because the story of Yitro starts out very similarly to Beshalach. Because we said that in Beshalach, what did Paro hear? He heard, I'm sorry, not what did Paro hear. How were events recorded in Parashat Beshalach? Vayhi beshalach paro et ha'am. Again, our source of information, the frequency that we tune into whether it's a radio channel, a TV channel, a newspaper, how we process current events is going to have a tremendous effect on how we process events as they are unfolding. So when we're going to process events that Paro took us out of Egypt, we're going to start to panic, and we're going to start to feel like we're victims, and we're going to start to wonder if God's even in our midst, because it's Paro who sent us out as opposed to God taking us out. So there still exists this concept when we get to Parashat Yitro, because it says that Yitro, what does he hear? Vayishma Yitro, Kohen Midian, Choten Moshe. This person, Yitro, hears et kol asher asa Elohim leMoshe u'Yisrael amo. Ki hotzi Hashem et Yisrael miMitzrayim. There's so much being said in this one verse. Let's take the easy pieces off. How is Yitro being introduced? He should have been called Kohen Midian Choten Moshe. His highly exalted mystic ruler. First we give all the titles and then we give the person's name. But our Parasha is going to call him Yitro and then explain who he is. He's the Kohen of Midian. We need to be so sensitive to this, especially since there are a lot of commentaries who will say that Yitro was such a great personality. He was so fantastic that he merited having the 10 commandments written in a parasha that's named after him. I belong to a different school of thought. So if you're hanging on to that dearly, I request that for a minute you consider a different way to view Yitro. And let's view him through the text, which calls him a Kohen Midian. He's walking in wearing his robes, his priestly robes, as being the priest of Midian. Secondary to that, he is Choten Moshe. So his first listing on his resume, what qualifies him to come to the camp? He's coming with the qualifications that he himself is a priest. Secondary to that, he's the father-in-law of Moshe. We're going to see how this is going to unfold. Now, what does he hear? Because he's wearing his priestly robes as priest of Midian, because he sees himself as the Kohen of Midian first and foremost, how is he interpreting the events of the Exodus? He is saying that he's seeing it kol asher asa Elohim leMoshe. You should, if you had a big bubble, it should start to deflate when you read this. Because we want all we've been trying to do for the last few weeks in our class, and all God's been trying to do the whole time in Egypt, is have his name be recorded and recognized as Yud-Ke Vav-Ke, as the God of the miracles, as the God of the miraculous, as the God who suspends the laws of nature. But yet, when we read that Yitro is coming with the influence of the priestliness of Midian, how is he telling his congregation about the Exodus? You know what he's saying? This is the working of Elohim. This was a natural occurrence. Elohim is the God, Bereshit bara Elohim, the God of creation. So what happened in Egypt was just a continuance of the way the world functioned. It was a cause and effect. It was not a supernatural occurrence where the God of the Jewish people just came in and did all of these fantastical miracles. This is very concerning when we read these words like this. We can't just read it 1, 2, 3. We have to know who Yitro is in verse 1, because in verse 1, he's coming in as the Kohen of Midian. And he's coming in believing that everything that happened in Egypt for Moshe and Yisrael was par for the course. It was part of the natural world. But then the Torah, you gotta love the way Torah comes in. There's nothing more gorgeous than this. We should stand up and applaud when we read the rest of that pasuk, because you don't see this every day. So enjoy it, because the Torah comes in its own voice and says, Ki hotzi Hashem et Yisrael mimitzrayim. Reader, don't listen to what we just wrote about Yitro and how he perceived the Exodus as being a natural occurrence. By no means was it a natural occurrence. Let me tell you something. Ki hotzi Hashem, it was Yud Ke Vav Ke, the God of miracles, who took the Jewish people out of Egypt. And then it says, the next verse, Vayikach Yitro choten Moshe. And since the Torah puts him in his place and says, excuse me, but you have it wrong. This was not something that was cause and effect. This was a total aberration and miracle and divine intervention that brought this about. Now, all of a sudden, we knocked Yitro down and he takes off, so to speak, in the verse. You could see the shedding taking place with each verse. What do I mean by the shedding? Because the next verse, he's only Choten Moshe. He checked his robe at the door. He checked his Kohen Midyan at the door. If you think you're going to bring your Midyan influence into the Jewish camp, you have another thing coming, because it's not the natural course that you may have been professing to your people. This was God in all his glory showing off and saying, I can suspend the laws and will suspend the laws and have suspended the laws for my people. So be aware of that and see how it's also unfolding in the Pesukim. So now that we sort of, if he thought he was going to be granted a visa and he thought he was going to be given citizenship into the Jewish people, because he's coming as a Kohen Midyan, he realizes not only isn't that going to work on my favor, on my resume, I better take it off my resume, because that's going to work against me. Believing that the world operates in a way that is just, one thing yields another, that's not going to bode well for me. So he takes away his whole accolades of being Kohen Midyan, and he decides it's not enough to just be Choten Moshe. I also have to bring Tzipora, his wife, and it says Achar Shilucheha. Either he sent her away because he was busy taking the Jews out of Egypt, and some commentaries go as far as to say that he had divorced her. But he also brings her two, et shne baneha, her two sons. In other words, in the separation, she got the kids, and now she has the two sons, Gershom and Eliezer. One was Gershom because Moshe had said he was a Ged. And maybe this is here to remind us that Yitro has some kind of credit, merit, that when Moshe was a nobody and a nothing, and he was a Ged and an Eretz Nochriah, Yitro took him in. So now that Yitro needs taking in, he wants to be able to remind Moshe that when he was on the outs, he was taken in, and now that he himself wants to be taken in, he has that zechut, let's say. And it keeps on going to say the name of Eliezer. He didn't just take him in, Yitro had harbored what do you call it? Escapee. Yatzileni micherev Paro. He was a runaway. He was a fugitive, and Paro took him in when he was when Moshe was at his lowest. So it says in the next verse, verse 5, Vayavo Yitro Choten Moshe, and who's coming now? Not just Yitro, the father-in-law of Moshe, ubanav ve'ishto. Maybe not just the sons and the wife of Moshe, but maybe the sons and the wife of Yitro. Yitro is coming with his own entire family. He's coming to the desert where Moshe is encamped, and he's coming specifically to Had HaElohim. And we should take a minute to say, Had HaElohim is the place where the whole story started. Had HaElohim is the place where the bush was burning, where Moshe was given his earliest directives. Had HaElohim, we'll remember, was Achad HaMidbar, was at the edge of the desert when Moshe was shepherding the sheep of Yitro. So technically, if we want to speak geographically, this Had HaElohim, this mountain where the bush was burning, where we also believe is Har Sinai, where God's going to give the Torah and they're going to worship me on this mountain, God had said, is in whose backyard? It's technically in Yitro's backyard. So it would make sense that when his son-in-law comes to town or is pretty nearby, that Yitro would at that point go and meet up with him. Now, verse 7, Moshe goes out to greet his father-in-law. His name isn't even mentioned here, it's just Chotno. So for somebody who started out with Yitro, Kohen, Midian, Choten, Moshe, he's only now relating to him as his father-in-law. And for that, he bows to him, he kisses him, they ask for each other's good health, and they come into the tent. Now, when Moshe asks, when Moshe tells his father-in-law the story of what happened, notice it's a he said, she said. Moshe is going to tell the story, and he's going to say, Kol asher asa Hashem leParo uleMitzrayim. Moshe's side of the story is going to believe, would you believe the miracles? Vayatzilem Hashem, how God saved us. And he's going to use the name Hashem, Hashem, Hashem over and over in the next 2-3 verses. It's all about Hashem. Vayichad Yitro, and Yitro gets, they say Vayichad is like chidudim, is like he gets the chills, he gets the goosebumps, because he realizes that Asher Asa Hashem li Yisrael, that what took place was something completely out of the ordinary. And you know what Yitro says? Baruch Hashem. Who's hearing violins in the background? It sounds to us at this point like Yitro came in all gangbusters. He came in and he was maybe going to impose his Midianic influences as the priest of Midian to them. But little by little, it seems like he's hearing from Moshe and he's coming on board. And when we read, don't get so comfortable, but I have to show it to you as it's unfolding. He says these words, Baruch Hashem. Yitro is blessing the Yud Kevavke, the God of the miracles, of the supernatural, of the everything that is totally fantastical. And he says, Asher hitzil etchem. He is the one who saved you from Mitzrayim, from the hand of Paro. And then he says in verse 11, and this is the entire story for today. In one verse, we know the mindset not only of Yitro, but for many future generations, this is going to be a mindset. So pay attention. Ataya dati, I know now, ki gadol Hashem, that Hashem is the greatest, mikol ha'elohim, of all the gods. If you're not careful, you'll miss the nuance in this verse. It's saying, or Yitro is saying, there are many Elohim acherim. There are many gods, and I will concede that of all the gods, the one that stands at the head is the Yud Kevavke. This is totally contrary to what God is going to tell us now soon in the 10 Commandments. So if this is his mindset, then everything that follows is going to follow with this idea, meaning there's a hierarchy, there's Yud Ke Vav Ke, then there's all other gods. What is in this dynamic? Why is this so important to Yitro? It's his job security. If he's the Kohen of Midian, he is ministering the people. He is the go-between. He is the conduit from his people to God. Now, if there's only one God, then we already have a conduit. We already have Moshe, who's the conduit to that God. But if we have many gods, then it's very easy to say, Yitro is now going to keep his job security, is going to say, Moshe is the conduit to Yud Ke Vav Ke, but there's also gods of the sun and gods of the moon and gods of the tide and gods of the agriculture and Mother Nature and all other things are out there. And that secures all of the other priests and the priesthoods to be able to say that they are priests ministering and go-betweens and agents between those gods and the people. It keeps the people away from having direct access, because you're going to see in the model of Moshe versus the model of Yitro, one identifying factor that's going to be our whole story. So I'll spell it out for you here through the verses quickly. When Yitro is saying that Hashem is the greatest of all the Elohim, he is now going to continue to call God Elohim. See, Vayikach Yitro Choten Moshe, verse 12, and he's gonna offer Olah and Zevachim to Elohim. So he hasn't abandoned, I'll say it this way, and maybe it's a little scary when we think of it this way, but we have to be honest. What Yitro is saying by saying that there are many gods is sometimes what we do unbeknownst to us, or what many of the, if you go to Israel and you go on a tour, it's a little scary and you won't believe it until you see it. You go to tour, let's say, the houses of the Kohanim, and they'll show you how they had a mikveh on the premises because they had to keep purifying themselves. But then they'll have these little vitrines and these little nooks and crannies, like shelves, that have these little mini idols. And you will ask the question and say, how could you be a Kohen and at the same time have idols? How does that even work? Why are the first 3 commandments in this week's Parashat going to talk about not having idols aside from me or in addition to me? And that's because as human beings, we like to hedge our bets. We do believe on some level there is a God, but just in case, I also need to cover myself by having this lucky charm, by having these external items that could possibly help my cause, just in case. And what God is going to tell us now, specifically here, now that Yitro is conceding and saying, okay, see, Paro didn't even want to acknowledge Hashem's existence. But Yitro is saying, if you can't beat him, join him. So we'll bring God in, we'll make him the chief of all the gods, but by no means are we removing the idea of multiple gods. We're still going to have polytheism. We're still going to have a lot of gods. We're just going to have Yud Ke Vav Ke Hashem at the head of all those gods. And we're going to see what happens when we buy into that story. So the next famous story you're all familiar with is that Moshe starts to judge the people. So look in verse 14. Choten Moshe sees everything that Moshe is doing to the people from the morning till the nighttime, because in verse 13, it had said that Moshe is judging them. And they're standing on Moshe from the morning till the night, and Yitro is watching this. And he says, Ma davar hazeh, what are you doing to the people? Why are you sitting by yourself? And all of the people are standing from the morning till the night. I use the same example every time. If you go to ShopRite and there's a very long line, and the manager comes and says, what? Why don't you open more registers? Why do you have to have one long line? Open up more registers, appoint for yourselves more sarim, and this way you'll be able to alleviate this pressure of all the people coming only to you, Moshe. And Moshe says, but the people are coming to me, lidrosh Elohim. They're coming to me, and the word Elohim is a curious one here, because all I've been saying is they want to come for the Yud Ke Vav Ke, but he's saying they're coming to seek out Elohim. And it's easy for the English because sometimes they'll say they are coming to seek judgment. Elohim is also a form of judgment. But we'll see what he was really saying as it unfolds. He says, because if they have an issue, they come to me and I am able to judge between a man and his friend, and I tell them the hukim of Elohim, maybe the laws of the land or the rules of the land, and his Torah. And the father-in-law of Moshe tells him, Lo tov, this is not a good thing that you're doing. Nabol tibol, you're going to end up self-destructing, you and the people, because there's too many people. The numbers don't support all these people versus just you, Moshe. Lo tuchal asohu levadecha. You can't do this yourself. And he gives him the famous advice that the commentaries say, this advice was so fantastic that Yitro gets the 10 commandments in his Parashat. Now, I'm sorry, I just have to state the obvious, which is it good advice? Yes. But does it take a genius to say, you got one person and 600,000 men, maybe we need more people to sort of make the lines shorter? I don't think that was what Yitro was saying. On the simplest level, he's saying, and I'll read it to you from the text so you could see. He says, Shema bekoli, listen to my voice. I'atzcha, I will advise you, and Elohim will be with you. He only uses Elohim, Yitro, you should know that. And you're going to stand, mul ha-Elohim, you're going to stand in the middle of Elohim, and you're going to bring everything, you're going to be the go-between. You're going to be the agent. You're going to be the conduit. In other words, says Yitro, let me tell you how it's done. I'll tell you how we do it in Midian. This is how it works. The people come to me and they say, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. And then I go and I take their confessions or their questions or whatever it is to the higher authority. What Yitro is suggesting is more go-betweens. When you'll see what God is going to suggest, which is the complete opposite. And he said, this way, you can tell them which way to go and which way to what to do. And this is his great advice. I'm fast forwarding to the end of his little parashiyah, which is verse 24, where Moshe listens to the voice of his father-in-law. And he does what his father-in-law had said, and he chooses men who are brave from Yisrael, and he makes them the heads, and he appoints them sarei me'ot, over the hundreds, over the 50s, and over the 10s. In other words, he creates a legislative body. And they judge the people at all times. And anything that's super difficult, they bring to Moshe. Moshe is like the Supreme Court. And the other judges are handling the easier cases. And v'chol hadavar hakaton, the little things, they handle. Vayishlach Moshe et chotno, and Moshe sends his father, and his father-in-law goes back to his country, to his aretz. And here is our story for today. If we would have left at the end of verse 27 when Yitro leaves, we would believe that this is the right way to govern a nation. And it might be the right way to govern a nation, but it's not the way to govern the Jewish people. And my suggestion is that God comes and gives his 10 commandments to the people, dafka, specifically now, not as a reward, but as a response. Because God is going to say, this system that you set up is going to lead the people to self-destruction. What do I mean by that? Immediately, Yitro exits stage right. And verse 1 in chapter 19 says, it was in the 3rd month that the Bnei Israel had left Mitzrayim. Bayom hazeh, on this exact day, they came to Sinai. Now, they've been at Sinai, they've been at Har HaElohim, we've been here, this is where Yitro came, but it's now, exactly at this moment in time, that Bnei Israel had traveled from Refidim, came to Midbar Sinai, camped in the Midbar, and they camp opposite the mountain. They've been here all along, the entire chapter 18, they've been here. But what is the Torah telling us? The occurrence and the exchange with Yitro insisted that we have chapter 19 happen now and not a second later. What's happening? Moshe goes up to the Elohim. Oh, it's just so nice. If you see verse 3, it tells the whole story. If you read it carefully, you don't even need to read the rest of the story, but we'll do it together anyway. Who's Moshe going up to? Ha-Elohim. But who's calling out to Moshe? Vayikra elav Yud-Ke Vav-Ke. Yitro came this close to getting the people to see God as Ha-Elohim, the greatest of all the gods. And God has to pull him back in and call to him and say, get the people ready, meaning whatever just happened at the end of the last chapter, Bayom Hazeh, we're not wasting a second. I need to respond to what Yitro was suggesting. And my response is my favorite verse of all verses ever is in verse 6. First, he says in verse 5, Im shamoa tishme'u bekoli, if you will listen to my voice, not to Yitro's voice, ushmartem et beriti, and you listen to my covenant, then you will be special from all the other nations. Don't fall into the trap of being like the other nations. What's wrong with you? You are nothing like the other nations. So you're not going to be governed like the other nations. You're going to be special, sigula, from all the nations, because I am the one who calls the shots. Ki li kol haaretz. And then verse 6, I can't even say it without smiling. I can't express how beautiful these words are for us today. Ve'atem tehiyuli. My plans for you, Bnei Israel, are for you to be a mamlechet kohanim and a goy kadosh. This is what I intend for you, not to be one of the run-of-the-mill other nations. Our nation, you know how it's different? Every one of you is a melech. Where have you ever heard of a nation where everybody's a king? Where every one of you is a kohen. There's not one king and one kohen. Every one of you is a king. Every one of you is a kohen. And that's what makes you a goy kadosh. That's what makes you a separate, holy nation than the other nations. And this is what you have to tell Bnei Israel. We don't operate like the other nations. And of course, God has to say this here and now to respond to the Yitro model that he was trying to introduce to us. And what does he say? He's now going to, this is our famous introduction to the giving of the 10 Commandments. He calls the elders. He speaks to them everything that Yud-Ke Vav-Ke had told him. Moshe is now back on track. If you happen to have your highlighters, you'll see the name of God appearing now in these next few Pesukim exactly 7 times. We are restoring the natural order of Yud-Ke Vav-Ke. It's an oxymoron, because in the world of Yud-Ke Vav-Ke, that's supernatural. But God is saying here and now, and that's what he's going to introduce to us, that the supernatural is part and parcel integrated with the natural. He showed it to us at the burning bush. Natural is for the tree to have disintegrated in the fire. But here in this place, at this time, in the natural world, there are going to be elements that are supernatural that are going to exist. Both the fire and the tree are going to coexist. The spiritual and the physical are going to coexist. And so too, when I'm going to bring for you now the Torah, this is the moment we've all been waiting for. This is the drum roll. This is the excitement of the day. Before giving the 10 commandments, God is going to say, Heyu nechonim, be prepared for the 3rd day. In other words, wash your clothes, purify yourself, because on the 3rd day, God himself, I'm in verse 11, I need you to see it together with me. Yered Hashem le'enei kol ha'am. This Yud-Ke Vav-Ke, which is the 7th occurrence of God's name in this story, is going to appear to the eyes of all the people on Har Sinai. That there should be enough for us to realize it's not like Yitro had suggested, where God's going to appear to the Kohen, and then the Kohen is going to bring the word down to the people. We may have thought that because we've had Moshe as a go-between up until now, but what God is inviting, what God is bringing into being now at this point, now that Yitro said, let's have go-betweens, you know what God is saying? I don't want any God go-betweens. I'm going to appear myself to the eyes of the nation. And while I'm saying this, you might think to yourself, wait a minute, but God does tell Moshe to go up the mountain, and Moshe does bring Torah down from Sinai, so we still have a go-between. So that's why it's so important to read Torah in its text, because the next verse is going to say, make sure you put a barrier, a gevul, a border, a boundary around the mountain, because we want to make sure that the people don't breach the boundaries and go up the mountain. Don't even touch the mountain, because anybody who touches the mountain, in verse 12, mot yumat, will die. So one side of my mouth is telling you that everybody's going to have an equal access to God. And on the very next verse, I'm saying, but no, you need to put a separation, and the people, if they touch the mountain, they might die. So which is it? And here is the answer you've all been waiting for. He says, Lo tigabo, make sure you don't touch the mountain. Because if anybody touches the mountain or tries to go up it, then they will be stoned, or the stones will throw them down. Whether it's an animal or a person, they will not live. And then the next 5 words should be our mantra. Ubi mishoch. So up until now, it does sound, you little people stay on the bottom. You Moshe, you're allowed on top. We didn't read the rest of the pasuk that says, Ubi mishoch hayovel. But when they hear the sound of the horn, of the Yovel horn being sounded, Hema ya'alu bahad, the people also will be able to come by the mountain. The border was a temporary one. The restriction from their coming up the mountain, it was only a temporary cordoning off of the mountain. As soon as they hear the sound of the Yovel trumpet being blown, at that point, b'mishoch hayovel hema ya'alu bahad, it was going to be an equal access for all. They too could come up. So again, this story of Har Sinai is a story for all of us, for all of humanity. It's not just a story that happened back then, because I had entitled the class, The Process of Revelation. And what does that mean, the process? Yes, God is going to reveal himself. Yered Hashem le'enei kol ha'am. Yes, he's going to reveal himself. But in order for that to happen, in order for the true revelation to happen, there has to be an internal awakening as well. B'mishoch hayovel means God is going to show himself, but you can't access him externally. You can't go up the mountain until you first awaken and access him internally. I gave you the story of Miriam because she accessed God internally. She became a prophetess. I gave you the story of Amalek to tell you there's a very fine line. There's 1 degree between the Moshe and the Amalek, between doubt and revelation. I brought you through Yitro, who's suggesting we just take a back seat to this whole thing called revelation, and we outsource it to the priests, and we let them be our go-betweens and carry our messages to and from God. But Parashat Yitro, God's going to come and reveal himself at this very second, by Yom Hazeh, at this moment, at this place, at this time, because he wants to make it clear that access to God is not intended to be something that we outsource. It's intended to be something that we insource, that comes from an internal place. And why do I say that with such conviction? Is because that's how now Matan Torah is going to present itself. God is going to come on the mountain. But unfortunately, if we had more time, we would go through all of the commandments. Vayered alav Hashem ba'esh. Verse 18, God comes down in a fire. And Har Sinai, I should start from the beginning of verse 18. Oh, there's so many pieces here. I don't know which ones is, okay. Calming down. Verse 17, Moshe goes to the people and he goes towards Ha-Elohim. He goes up towards the God from the Machaneh, and everybody is hityatzvu. They are all standing at attention with purpose, like Nitzivim. They have a complete sense of upright standing at the bottom of the mountain. That's how we start out. Har Sinai is all smoking because God himself, the Yud-Ke Vav-Ke, appeared in a fire. And the smoke is like the smoke of a billowing furnace. And the people are, and the mountain itself is shaking. And they hear the sound of the shofar. It's getting louder and louder. and Moshe is speaking, and Elohim is answering him. I know you're nervous about this word Elohim, but you're going to see that what starts out, it's just confirming for us that the people at this point started out with the understanding that God was the greatest of all the gods. So he's coming to them and they're approaching him as the head of many gods. But finally, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai, the God, the one and only monotheistic God, who's the only God that exists, comes down on Sinai, and that God calls to Moshe, and that Yud Ke Vav Ke tells Moshe, make sure you tell the people not to breach the mountain. And it over and over, Veha'am al yehirsu la'alot. Why does God a second time have to tell them not to breach the mountain? He already told it to them the first time. You see, the first time they were seeing him as Elohim, as the God of the many gods. As the God of the many gods, they might not think to breach the mountain because they might think that there is a go-between. But as the God who is saying, every one of you has direct access to me. If I have direct access, then I don't need to wait down here. I feel my connection to God, so I can go right up. That's where the greater danger lies. And it's at this point that God comes and reveals himself in chapter 20, and his first 3 revelations to the people are, I am Hashem, Anochi Hashem. I want you to relate to me as Hashem, as the only God, and I'm the one who took you out of Egypt. Pharaoh didn't send you out of Egypt. All the gods of the Niles and all those other gods, they didn't take you out. It was me. I am the one and the same of the Yud Ke Vav Ke. With the second command, he says, you can't have any other Elohim acherim al panai. I don't know what Yitro has been feeding you, but if I'm to be your God, the one who takes you out of Egypt, then I operate exclusive of any other gods. That means it's me and only me. You can't have these other insurance policies, these other good luck charms, these other amulets, these other little things that you're going to put your trust in just in case. There's no just in case. When I am your God, that's all you need. You don't need anything else, al panai. And the third one, which is, lo ta'aseh lecha pesel. Don't make something tangible. Don't reduce me to something tangible, because I'm not. See, why would people make something called a pesel? Why would anybody make something like an idol? Because an idol gives people control. It's something that they made, that they control, that they access. And God is saying, if you want me to be your God, you have to relinquish, you have to stop trying to manipulate the divine. It's once you want to manipulate divinity, then you're making yourself the one who's in control. But if you relinquish control to God, then you let God do his thing. Because when you're in control, you're so limited. There's just so much that you could control. But when I'm in control, and I'm in control as the Yud Ke Vav Ke, then everything and anything is possible. So do yourselves a favor and don't stifle or suffocate, or I don't even know what's the word. Don't minimize our relationship by bringing something tangible. The whole idea of the emunah, Vayhi Yadav Emunah, is knowing and believing that in yourself, in your hands, the actualization of miracles stands within you. And how are you going to use those hands? If you're going to use them to build an idol, then you lost all of the potency and the power in your hands. But if you're going to use your hands to be part prayer to God, because that's what Moshe was doing up on the mountain, and part using your own God-given potential and strength to problem solve, if you're going to use that, that's why you have two yadayim, the right hand and the left hand. One hand is for prayer and the other one is for action. One is for the physical and one is for the spiritual. And this is what God is impressing upon the people at this point. And then it says, Lo tisait Shem Hashem Elohecha lashav. It doesn't mean don't swear in vain. Don't say God's name in vain. It doesn't mean don't overuse God's name. You know what it means? It means don't underuse God's name. Don't carry God's name as if it has no weight. Don't say, what's calling upon God going to do for me? How's calling upon God going to help me? If you don't call on the name of God, that's a form of desecrating his name. You have tremendous potential with God's name. And if you don't invoke it and you don't access it and you don't activate it and you don't use it and you don't beseech it, then you're taking God's name and you're making it weightless, useless, nothingness. So if anything, lo tisa et Shem Hashem lashav, don't carry it as if it has no weight, means every single day, use God's name. Every single day, recognize that the invoking of his name carries tremendous strength and force and power. I'm sorry, I know I'm over time, but I just want to end with the last one because I think it's so important, and that is the Shabbat. And I think because the Shabbat is going to bring together everything we've discussed until now, I wanted to cover this quickly. There is another set of commandments in Parashat Va'etchanan. And in that set, the Shabbat appears differently. Here, it says, remember the Shabbat, 6 days do your work. On the 7th is a Shabbat for God. Don't do any labor, not you, not your sons or daughters, not your servants or your maidservants or your animals, or the gerim that live in your gates, because in 6 days God created the heavens and the waters and everything that is in it, and on the 7th day he rested. God is telling us here at this point in time, when he's holding the microphone, and this is the most important thing to remember, here in Parashat Yitro, God is speaking directly to the people. And in speaking directly to the people, he is suggesting that religion is faith-based. You have to base it on the belief that God is the creator. And you have to base it on the spirituality of creation. And you keep Shabbat because God created the world. And he's giving an intellect a reason that to keep the Shabbat means to confirm that God is the creator, and that's how you're going to access this thing called revelation. You're going to believe it with your intellect and your mind. And unfortunately, what happens in this week's Parashat is that the people recoil and they retreat and they can't handle it. And they end up seeing what they should have heard. They see the thunder. They hear the lightning. They hear what they should have seen because their senses become confounded. Because when God gives the Torah from above to below, when he gives it from the heavens towards the earth, when it comes down to us in this type of faith-based modality, it's very hard for the people to sign and come on board. When we go to Parashat Va'etchanan and we see how Shabbat is introduced to us from Moshe, he's going to be the one who's going to tell the commandments. Here, the commandments are going to come from below to above. They're coming from a human perspective, from a human-based viewpoint. Here, the Torah is going to tell us about keeping the Shabbat, and it's going to say Shamoret Yom HaShabbat lekodsho, and it's going to say for 6 days do your work. Keep your agricultural schedule for 6 days. But on the 7th day, don't do any work, you and all your people, because you were once a slave in Egypt. What Moshe is telling the people, the process of revelation, when it comes from an external source to the internal, when it comes from the heaven to the earth, when God is speaking to the people and it's coming from outside of us, it's very hard to awaken the revelation, the godliness, the spirit that's within us when it's being awoken from something external to us. Moshe, a human being who understands how human beings function, is going to give us the second telling of the 10 commandments, and he's going to approach it not from the creation of the world, he's going to approach it from our humanity-based labor, work, physical place, which says, wow, I understand that you are people, you are workers, you are laborers. That's where you come from. And from this perspective, I'd like to say that when you are able to perceive God in a horizontal way, man and his friend and his servant and his laborer, horizontal in the sense of we're talking about working the land and the agriculture. We don't see the heavens and the stars and all of those things that we saw the first time. Moshe makes it real, and he says, the same way we started to say, beyadecha, if you take what's in your hand and you see the godliness in the physical, then and only then will that be able to emerge, and will the revelation that comes from within be a sustainable one. As a matter of fact, that's why it says, Vayihi, it says specifically in verse 20, I'm all the way in Parashat Vayetchanan in chapter 5, it says, you go, and then and only then will you be able to hear the sounds, Sham'achem et hakol, and you'll be able to see the fire. You'll be able, what is he saying? If we want to get our natural senses in order and not be confounded, then we have to bring ourselves to a place where our trust and faith from God comes from an internal place. If we're going to wait to see lightning and thunder and seas splitting and hail falling, that's going to be a very short-lived event. What God is telling us is that in order for the revelation to have a sense of sustainability, we have to literally tap in from our own place, from our own, don't expect, I should say it differently, don't expect your aha moment to come from afar. And for sure, don't expect somebody else to be your agent to the divine. That's for sure. Parashat Yitro tells us one thing is that God is saying every one of you is a melech, every one of you is a kohen, every one of you has direct access, and I had invited every one of you, every one of you was intended to come up the mountain. The reason that never happened is because you recoiled, because when we try to access a sense of emunah, or a sense of belief in God, or a sense of understanding in a way that's coming to us from an external point, it's not going to penetrate us, not going to come inside of us. What's going to come, what's going to be the way that we're going to ultimately access God is if we can dig deep and realize, it's like the old Wizard of Oz, It's been within us all along. So if we try to get courage, or we try to get brains, or we try to get home from something external to us, we're never going to reach it. So Yitro, we love you, but we're not going to get to where we need to be by appointing more in between people and more agents. That's out. What we have to do is we have to literally work on the ability that's within us, within our hands, through our agriculture, through our interacting with people, through society, through realizing that it's all within our hands. By Yadayim, the Yadayim is the place that we can use by working, by keeping all of these laws. That's what's going to ultimately lead us to an understanding that is going to be a true and, God willing, a sustainable one, that we could one day really hope and pray that we will absorb so much of this faith and believe that we too could be the conduits. We could be the Miriam HaNevi'ah, we could be the Moshe Rabbeinu, we could be that light, that we have so much of it radiating and oozing out of every pore of our body that we could affect finally our families and our communities and the world at large. But first we have to not bring it in, but we have to bring it out. So don't wait around for the vision or the voice. Listen to the voice that's inside of you, that quiet, small voice. You need to tap into that. And if you're listening to the voice that's internal, that's inside of you, it is there. And you have the belief, and you learn these stories, and you say Hashem has done and will continue to do, you're heading in the path to tapping into this wellspring of power and energy that is all good and all light. So I hope and pray that we can all access this, access as much of it as we can, and ultimately share it with the entire world and create a beautiful place.